Good afternoon and welcome back to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Mo Wright, President of Raymond Consulting, and for one more day, I'm going to be chairman of the Columbus Metropolitan Club. Today, the Columbus Metropolitan Club presents Striving for Equity. It is the Mary Lazarus Legacy Forum, and it's sponsored by a number of companies today, including King Business Interiors, Gebman Communications, Barnes & Thornburg, Columbus Business First, WBNS 10 TV, and in partnership with the Women's Fund of Central Ohio. Let's thank all of our sponsors and partners for their support today. And now it's my pleasure to welcome to the podium Nicole Dunn, President and CEO of the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, who will introduce our forum today. Nicole?
Perfect. All right, good afternoon. Hi, everyone. So, as Jane was telling us earlier, it is with courage and vision and desire to make things better that characterize the women who founded the Columbus Metropolitan Club in 1976. Theirs was a time when women were not necessarily included in those important community discussions, and definitely not included, invited, or having a seat at the table with men. Mary Lazarus is and was one of those women. I'm looking for her at the table, right in front of me. Mary. Mary has consistently led the charge to move women from the sidelines to the front lines. And starting as a volunteer with the League of Women Voters, her leadership efforts led to the Planned Parenthood here in Ohio, as well as founding the Women's Fund of Central Ohio. Today, we host the inaugural Mary K. Lazarus Forum. And this is important because, as I know Mary, she didn't do this or anything for her name or for her to get recognition. What matters to Mary is that there's always the importance and the need to have the issues about women and girls on the forefront and to create the space for that to happen. So this forum and going forward will ensure that Mary's legacy as a founder of CMC will hold steadfast to this commitment and celebrate the society of women that we have. So one more time, please thank Mary Lazarus for this and her commitment. You're welcome. Today's forum features a conversation about the first of its kind Columbus Women's Commission. So it's dedicated to establishing equal opportunity for all women. And now that the commission has been established and seated, and there's work beginning, we're going to hear about the challenges that have been faced and the work that's being planned. So please welcome First Lady of Columbus and Chair of the Women's Commission, Shannon Ginther. Next, we have CFO of Cardinal Health and gender equality advocate, Mike Kaufmann. And the dynamic and unstoppable Columbus City Council member, Elizabeth Brown. And then our intelligent and incredible host and journalist from WBNS 10 TV, Yolanda Harris. And on that note, the podium's yours.
All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the Columbus Metropolitan Club for inviting me to come out and host today's forum, Striving for Equity. Working at 10 TV, fortunately, I've had the opportunity to learn more about the Women's Commission. I met First Lady Ginther, and we talked a lot about this, and there is a need for it. And their work is to improve the lives of women in our community, starting with pay equity. Unfortunately, there's a lot of improving we need to do. On average, women in Columbus are paid 78 cents for every dollar a man makes, and 27% of female heads of households are economically insecure. In this room today, there are employers, so I want to commend you for coming out with an open mind and an open ear, and hopefully a desire to enact change. So let's get right to our panelists with our questions. And I will say, First Lady Ginther, you have mentioned that the community is ready for this conversation. Why do you believe that now is the time that employers are ready to listen and to begin to tackle this pay equity issue?
First of all, thanks, Yolanda, for hosting this today, and to the Metropolitan Club. It's an important conversation. Also want to thank the sponsors and, of course, Andy, the mayor, who's here, steadfastly supporting this work. We appreciate it. Employers, to answer your question, are ready to have this conversation. What we've learned as we've worked in the community is that this is not just the right thing to do, it's also the right thing for business. Investors are increasingly looking to invest in communities and companies that are focused on gender equity, on pay equity, and on making sure that all of their employees are valued for the work that they do.
I couldn't agree more. As I think about it as a large employer here in Central Ohio, all of us as employers, one of the most important things we have to do is attract talent. You can't win without the best talent. And if you're excluding 50% of the talent, and if you actually look at college graduates, 60% or more of the talent, then you cannot compete effectively as a company. And so I agree, it's not only the right and moral thing to do, it's the smart thing to do if you want to run a successful company.
Okay. You've hit the nose on the head as why it would be important to business owners. Why do you think pay inequity is such a prevalent issue right now, and it has been over the years? Why is it such a problem?
Go ahead.
I just don't think it depends on the company and the area. I don't think it often gets attention. I think a lot of folks just assume that pay is equal. And, while you could dispute whether 78 or 79 or 85 and all those are the right numbers, and I find sometimes people get into debates around that, and I think that's...
Well, we know it's not equal.
Right, yeah.
There you go, yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's not equal, so let's set the debate aside. The pay is not equal, but I think we actually hurt the situation. We spend time on the debate around pay, because the real reason, that a big piece of why women aren't paid that you would never see that's kind of the underbelly is the fact that you might have a woman and a man that are both, say, directors at a company making $120,000. Everybody says, oh, their pay's equal, and that's great. But what happens 2 years later when the male gets a chance to go on some great assignment that they really learn and do all this great stuff, but the woman never got a chance because the guy sat around in a room, and I've seen this happen, and they go, you know what, she's got 3 kids, and it'd probably be hard for her to go to Ireland for 6 months and work on this topic because it's going to be messy and it's going to be hard. So let's not ask her, even though she's equally or better qualified. We'll ask Joe. Joe goes, he knocks the ball out of the park, and when the promotion comes 2 years later, Joe gets it and the female doesn't. That's what's creating a lot of the pay equity. It's all these other things that are hard to fix. It's not hard for managers to sit and look at payroll data and see you have 2 people in the same job and fix it. We tell people every day, fix it. That's not hard. What's hard is getting people to realize they need to stop these other activities that don't help them. There's a long list, and I don't want to, I could spend the whole time talking about it, but that's one for sure.
I think that's exactly right, and I think that the conversation about pay inequity in many ways is an entree to seeing a lot of the problems with workplace policies in relation to the advancement and fair pay of women and just women's role across wage sectors of our economy too. In general, our workplace policies are really based around this idea that households in America are one male breadwinner and one female. And that has never really been reality in America, by the way. I mean, for wealthy people, maybe at one point it was, but the reality of the modern American family has never looked like that. We are finally now, I think, having the conversation to try to reconcile our workplace policies. But one thing that I think about a lot is really in line with what you just said, Mike, relating to sort of women's place in raising families. And we view that as a caregiving role and not as an economic contributor to our society, which is just a warped way to kind of view the whole economic spectrum. And it allows things that harm our economy to persist. So one of my favorite statistics is MetLife did a study that showed women on average lose $325,000 over their lifetime in income on average due to caregiving duties.
I'm not just talking about mothers, I'm also talking about America's working daughters. I see Fran Ryan in the audience, and I know she spends a lot of her time working on supporting caregivers. We have an aging population in our country, and I think if we don't really get our arms around the full picture of workplace inequities when it comes to men and women, we're going to see that $325,000 a year only increase, and also harm our economy.
Since you're speaking on that, what other ways do you think women could be supported in their roles as heads of households, as mothers, as caregivers?
Paid family leave. I think people who know me, I sound like a broken record, but it's just a critical policy to put in place across. We need a national standard for it, first of all, because the statistics now are depressing. Only 13% of American workers have access to paid family leave. But when you look at low-wage workers, only 4% have access to paid family leave. And, we wonder why we have generational poverty. We wonder why we have, disparate health outcomes among people who make lower wages and versus higher wages. And I think a lot of it goes back to whether we're giving kids a chance at the outset. And so much of giving kids a chance is trusting women and empowering women.
Mm-hmm. I also think you have to find ways to help the women on board back when they're off. So it's like to go from 0 to 60, like they're completely off, and then they're expected to come back on day one. So trying a way to help work them back into the workforce is something that we're looking at. I know a lot of the professional services firms, large accounting firms and those guys do a really good job of finding ways to work women back into it. One of the ways we've been tapping is we put together a program to help women that are working mothers. We specifically are looking for women that only want to work 30 hours a week, that aren't ready to get back full time, but we know we're probably very successful folks at public accounting firms or whatever, and so in the accounting group we're finding these amazing talent that says, I'd love to work from 9 to 3 so I can get my kids to school and get back. I can do that for a few years until my kids are at an older age. Then maybe we've got this great pipeline of talented women. So I think finding a way to help women on board too when they've either been out of the workforce or on these leaves is important to help them come back as much as getting paid for it too.
And to help men do the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Great
Absolutely. First Lady Ginther, with the Women's Commission, you've been hearing a lot of stories that women are sharing with you about their needs, about pay inequity, and how they overcome that and deal with that in their households. As you get deeper into this issue, what are women sharing with you? What are they saying to you when they share their stories?
So some of what we're actually hearing starts with pay equity, but very quickly kind of erodes, if you will, into discussions about safe and affordable housing, about health and nutrition. We know that women in this community, by the work we've done partnering with other community agencies who have gathered this data for us, that women are disproportionately impacted by evictions in this community. We are second only to New York City in the number of evictions that we move along here in the city of Columbus. That's something we need to change because we also know that those are the women and families that show up in shelters. And you partner an eviction and showing up in a shelter with 250,000 unit shortage of affordable housing in this community, and very quickly you have a family that is unable to make it and is unable to secure housing, which impacts the kids' lives, obviously with schooling, et cetera. So I think while pay equity is one focus, it's not the only focus for women in this community, and the Women's Commission is focused on improving the economic position of women in this community. Pay equity is a huge piece of that, but there are other things that we have to focus on as well.
Now, I know that the Women's Commission is made up of people from all generations, gender, racial ethnicities. When the millennial, you do have at least one millennial member, the younger generation coming up, do they see this? Do they come out, do they enter the workforce? Do they come out of college thinking that things are equal, or are you finding that they are just as well-versed as the rest of us are in how things are?
I think they're pretty well aware of what's happening. I think the tolerance level is different. I think in some instances, some generations have just not liked it, but accepted the fact that we are not paid equally. But millennials are kind of dumbfounded by it and thinking, well, how could this be? And we have to change this. And we do.
No, it's interesting. I get a chance, like I'll be actually speaking next week at a university, and I've spoken at several over the years, and I'm amazed that when I talk to university students, they actually, a lot of what I talk about, they look at me kind of strange and go, well, that's never going to happen to me. And they don't understand that once they get into the work environment, you know, they start to realize it takes time. So some of my messages when I'm trying to explain things to them, they'll come up to me and it's like, I just can't imagine that would happen. And I'm like, I wish it wouldn't, but here's some of the things you need to make sure so it doesn't happen. So it's often a message to both men and women of things they need to do to make sure it doesn't. But they do come out of school perceiving everything will be equal and it'll just solve itself. But people have probably been doing that for 40 years, and we've made almost no progress in gender equity, and so it's clearly something that happens after college.
Yeah, I think it was Gloria Steinem who said life radicalizes you. There's a lot of wisdom in that. There's something wonderful about youthful optimism. I think it can change the world in many ways. But that same perception that how can that really be a problem could lead to inertia if there aren't other folks at the table really pushing that cross generational collaboration to make sure that young people are engaged in this fight, because they're going to carry the fight forward.
As a business leader, as our only man on the panel right now, hearing from you, it seems, Mike, you get it. And it's important to you to close this gap and make things more equal. How do you feel about leadership in our businesses in general? Do you believe that they're ready to have this conversation? Do you believe that they're ready to enact change? And do they even see this as an issue? Do most business leaders even see this as an issue?
I would love to say yes. I don't think any of you would believe me if I said it, because I think we know that that's not the case, or the numbers would get better. I'd love it if every single person at Cardinal got it. And I think, wow, more than most do, not everybody does. And so that's why I'm so passionate about it. I have a daughter, and I have an amazing wife and a daughter, and I want to see things better for, particularly for my daughter as she enters the workforce. And so I don't think a lot of men get it. So one of our actual initiatives at Cardinal, and I really recommend this, so many companies I talk to have women's initiatives. We have a women's initiative network. But when I actually talk to them, all they have is women on their women's initiative. So they only invite women to it. And what happens is, and I've even had this discussion with outside organizations like Healthcare Businesswomen's, HBA and other ones, is all women sitting around talking about women on women's issues, and they feel better, but the numbers never change. And that's because 95% of the CEOs are men, 84% to 87% of all the senior executives are men, and if you don't engage them, they're not changing because it's working for them. And so, and it's not It's not that men don't care. They truly do. Like, for instance, when I saw a group of men make a decision to put this male over a female into a training program, the conversation was around, it wasn't being mean, it was like they were talking about both, and it was clear she was more qualified, but then somebody said, well, she's got 3 kids, literally. And then they went, oh, wow, this is going to take a lot of nights, and you got to go out of town, and how is she going to do that? And they thought they were doing her a favor. And so next thing you know, they're like, yeah, let's put him in it. And luckily I was there, so I stopped it, and I said, but who's better qualified? And they said, her. And I said, well, you ask her. If she can't do it, support her. Maybe then the next time. But if she can, let her go. So they're not doing it to do it on purpose. And many men I talk to really, truly believe they get it. But then when you ask them the last time they've held a job open, the last time they've interviewed people other than those that raise their hand for a job, when women don't raise their hand as often as men, and you ask them those tough questions, when's the last time in a talent review someone spoke about a male is, hard charging, go get it, all over, and then the female comes up and they say, she's kind of hard to deal with, she's kind of naggy. And you're like, when's the last time you asked the question, well, tell me the true difference between those two, and then you look at them and they don't have an answer. So if you don't engage men, they're the ones sitting in the room making the decisions, and without engaging them, it just doesn't get better. So, sorry.
No, that's good. I'm like, give him a round of applause. Absolutely. And on that topic, you see that that's an issue. How can leadership be moved into action when it comes to getting involved in the conversation, getting in those meetings and those women's groups, women's commissions, and leveling the playing field when it comes to this?
I can start with that. So while I absolutely hear everything you're saying, I have noticed in this community a bit of a shift in terms of corporations, nonprofits wanting to have this discussion. We hosted a pay equity breakfast, the mayor and I did, on April 4th. We had 50 companies, small, medium, large, come to have the conversation. Many of the CEOs in the room said, this issue never hits my radar screen, but I want it to. I never knew there was a problem until you showed me the data. And so we have to start there with at least demonstrating that there is a problem and why it's a problem. And my experience has been, before that conversation and definitely since then, companies are willing to have the conversation. They need to know how, they need some tools. Not everybody has a Cardinal that can have data analytics, et cetera. Some of these places we're talking about mom and pop shops. And so helping employers with those discussions is key to starting to move the needle.
I agree. That's what I mean. If you engage men and you invite them to these types of events or other ones that are going to be out there, and they actually start to hear the message, they go, oh, I'm missing something, and then they begin to get engaged. But if you don't have senior leadership committed to it, it fades. When the senior leader isn't committed, now we're lucky. We have senior leadership commitment, but when you don't, people will prioritize other things if they don't believe the leader is committed to it. So it's really important that, like you said, to get them engaged. And I see it shifting too.
And I'm biased on this front because I serve on the Women's Commission that Shannon put together, but I just believe so much in the importance of an organized community effort like this to have the conversation, because just waiting, as Mike so beautifully put, isn't going to get us there. And when you have a deliberate community conversation, you can also talk about the all of the nuances in this discussion. I mean, equal pay day is April 4th, right? And that represents when how long a woman has to work in order to make what the typical man made the year before, right? So a man makes something January to December, and then a woman has to work till April to make that same. Well, July 31st was African American Women's Equal Pay Day, and we still haven't reached Latina Women's Equal Pay Day. I believe it's in November. November 2nd. So we have to be very deliberate about these conversations and illustrate the impact it has on members of our community. And again, it's about the economy. We're losing spending power when we do that, right? Like we're losing that economic contribution that all women do make.
And these women, by the way, make 90% of household spending decisions. Healthcare, goods and services, all the money that flows out of a household, a woman's making the decision.
Yep.
And a lot of this information people may not know. The numbers, as Mike mentioned, are different at times, but I know, First Lady, you have done a lot of research on this. You can spew those numbers and facts off from the top of your head. I know that from interviewing you. We've talked about it takes women 4 additional months to make what a man makes in a year. You've also spoken about heads of households. What are some of the other little tidbits of information that people in this audience may not know, but you know these facts from what you've been doing with the Women's Commission?
Sure. So in this community, as we know, 78 cents on the dollar is the pay disparity at this point. We also know here in this community that 15.2% of households are single female-headed households. That's a lot when you're thinking about that there's a pay disparity. We also know that 2/3 of minimum wage workers in this community are women. And we know that a substantial number of women actually have less than $15,000 a year in income. So we start to put these pieces together, and we start to understand why a woman has a crisis, misses rent, gets evicted, then is no longer able to afford housing, and is closed out from subsidized housing, and the spiral continues and poverty gets deeper. And I will tell you, one of the experiences of my life was sitting in eviction court a couple of weeks ago and watching the defendants. Almost every single one of them was a woman. Many of them had baby carriages with them. These are women who will be impacted forever. These kids will be impacted forever. And Shelley Biting, who's the executive director of the Women's Commission, she texted me and she said, boy, that baby in that baby carriage has a hard life ahead of them in this kind of poverty. And so I recognize that that's a kind of a flat projection of what's happening for women, but I feel really passionate about the fact that we have to understand what's happening in our community to start to change the conversation. And I believe in this community and that this community will start to change what we're doing. But the first step in that is understanding the problem before we can engineer solutions.
What is the newest thing that the Women's Commission is looking ahead to?
Around the first, in addition to our focus on pay equity and evictions, we'll be launching a community health strategy around the first of the year. We've been doing a lot of work gathering data so that we know that there are issues impacting women specifically in their health and wellness. We know, for example, that in Franklinton, the average life expectancy is 62.4 years, and in the neighboring community, literally right next door, Grandview, the average life expectancy is 85 plus years. So those are some of the things we want to start to understand why. And then link in with things that are already happening in this community. One of the things that we have been very intentional about the Women's Commission is making sure we're not duplicating what's already happening, but instead drawing on community partners who are already working in these spaces and figuring out how we can elevate some of those conversations to change the story in a meaningful way, because we're all more powerful together than separate.
And Shannon, you told me that when Mayor Ginther, as you call Andy.
I'm the only one allowed to call him that, by the way.
That's why I said, as you call. Yes, only you. When he became mayor, his passion was for neighborhoods and equity, and you got involved in starting this. And I ask you all, how do we measure success as a community? What is your ideal of that? And women are a big part of that, and I would imagine their success is pertinent to a community's success.
For me, it's about starting to measure the impact on our neighborhoods, the number of evictions, the number of vacant houses, the infant mortality rates in our community as a whole, but especially in, I believe it's 9 hotspot communities that have been identified in this community. Starting to move the number on pay equity, although that's not going to happen overnight. There are definitely some leading indicators I think we can start to measure very quickly. Are some of the changes that we're working to implement impacting evictions, which we know are disproportionately impacting women and families and thereby neighborhoods. So those are some of the starting points. I think some key community health indicators that are already measured in this community, we can start to look for a change.
Mike, Elizabeth, anyone?
Go ahead.
I can't say it much better than Shannon. I guess the one thing I would add, which is really taking a look at the overall health of our community, we need to score better on the mobility index. Your ability, if you're born in a lower income rung, to be able to move into the middle class. We don't do very well on that score yet, I'm going to say, here in Columbus. And I know that we can do better. And given how important women are in driving our economy, I think when we see that number move, it will be an indicator of health for women.
From my perspective, maybe I obviously couldn't agree with these folks more than that, because if you don't have a community with capable employees, to be able to attract talent and make people want to move into this community, to be able to get the best and the brightest. And if you don't have the right school systems and the right housing and all that, you can't do that. So that's foundational. If that stuff doesn't happen, the rest of it, doesn't happen. But I do think, I would continue to hope that various employers in town would all share best practices with each other. Whatever you're doing, none of us should have egos around what we do when it comes to gender equity. If there's something that one company is doing at Nationwide or Ohio Health or Huntington or wherever, and they've got something that they can share with Cardinal or vice versa or with each other, I think we need to come together as a community of employers and talk about the things that we've done that are successful to get men engaged and to get women engaged in helping other women, and tell us each other what hasn't been successful. And I think if we could do that after all this foundational stuff's got to continue, that's how we really become like one of the best places in the entire country to work and live and raise a family.
Absolutely. Okay. We're going to move to the audience questions in a few minutes. So the microphone is right there. Don't be shy. Come on up. Form a line there, and we'll get to you guys in a few minutes. So step up to the microphone, so we'll be ready for that. I'm going to ask our panel a final thought before we move to that portion. And I wanted to ask, the research is done, the problem is known, the work is beginning. We know that this is a marathon, not a sprint. It's going to take time. This is just the beginning. Is it feasible this can be done? Can we truly reach equal pay for equal work when it comes to gender inequities?
Absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely feasible. If we, I don't know the timeline on it, but I know that the timeline starts now. That it's within all of our power to make that timeline start now, and the collaboration that we can pull together between the public and private sector and civic sector, the coordinated work that First Lady Ginther is leading. I'm very hopeful that we can do it, and I just think it's important for us to again recognize how big the conversation is. It's not just about leadership roles, it's about those who are working in low-wage jobs too. And when we have our eye on the very big prize, I do think it's feasible.
Absolutely. This fall, actually, the Women's Commission, in partnership with the Mayor's Office and some early adopters, corporations, nonprofits, will be launching a voluntary pay equity pledge, which will call on employers to sign on to start to look at their numbers and participate in best practices learning collaboratives to start to move the numbers. So that's a very concrete first step, recognizing that's not the only step, and we'll build on that work, but we will get there.
I also agree. I do think it's achievable. I think the time frame's longer than we would all like it to be. I think there is the simple things, like I said, of just matching up like jobs and people making decisions and doing them. The piece that's the much longer piece is educating the men and women around all those other issues that aren't about pay equity today, but it's creating that pipeline and giving women the opportunities to be executive vice presidents, CEOs, and all those types of things. And that's the part that's harder. But we do a 3-day training class. It's hard to get executives pulled out. But I'm just telling you, when I've seen some of the men, particularly because the women are highly motivated to learn about themselves, and they often find out they're the worst arsonist in their own fire, as Rayona, the teacher, the lady that teaches this, helps women understand what they can do to help themselves and help other women. But to watch the men that have gone through this, who thought they got it and then come out at the end, and watch the way they're engaged, like I'm telling you, it sends chills down my spine when I think of some of these guys and how they're completely different individuals. And so as companies can begin to do these types of things, and I've seen what engaged men and women can do and the power, and so absolutely, it's possible. I just wish it wasn't going to take as long as it probably will.
We all do. We all do. Thank you very much. And I just want to share, I believe it may have been Joel Osteen I was listening to, and he touched on something very important, and hopefully we all remember that in our lives and in our pathways to what we do in the workplace. You never stand as tall in your path to success as when you reach down to help someone else. And that hit me, and I thought, that is so true. And I believe that's what our panelists are up here doing in their everyday lives. All right, it is the CMC's tradition to take audience questions, so we've reached that part of the program. So what I want to ask you is stand in line. We'll get to as many of you as we can. Please state your name, ask your question, and of course, in consideration to everyone, stick to the questions rather than editorials. First question, please state your name, ask your question.
Hi, my name is Renee Delane, and I'm the CEO of Women Who Dare, and I'm interested in my team helping with the inclusion part. I started out in a business basically focused on women. I moved to D&I, diversity and inclusion, and within the last 3 months I've done tremendous research on what's happening with inclusion. Inclusion means affinity groups are fine, but you need to have inclusion councils where the CEO, the guy at the top, is down with everybody else having a voice so that you have everybody's opinion integrated, and these men can find out really what's happening, and then they will have some tools to work with. So I'm asking you, I would love to get some more information. I'm doing a lot of research on my own, but I want to hear it from experts. So if anybody in the audience, or if you want to share some information with me or get together with me, believe me, I would be deeply honored.
I know, speaking on behalf of the Women's Commission, we appreciate that. We have a website, and Shelley's contact information is on the website. You can also email me when we'll be certain to get you connected in with the work we're doing, and we'd love to learn from you as well. That's a big part of our conversation is community conversation and recognizing that a few of us can't get in a room and engineer a solution. You bring people to the table. So
I think it's great that the conversation's a broader one around inclusion instead of, but Maya, and I totally believe in we all get engaged in D&I, but if you don't get it right with gender equity, I'm not sure how you're going to get it right in general inclusion. So that's why I always focus on this. But overall, my goal has always been inclusion in general, but you got to get it right with 50% of the population.
Mm-hmm. Please state your name and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Warren Fishman. You touched on affordable housing and the amount of single female parents we have. In my limited interaction with single female parents, I've noticed that many of them get no child support, and it takes two to have a kid usually. And if they get child support, I've actually heard men complaining that they're paying $400 a month for 2 kids or whatever, and that won't even pay for child care. And I wonder if the judges shouldn't be getting tougher on the other person responsible, because that's a huge detriment for women finding affordable housing and getting a full-time job, is that they can't pay for child care and they can't, so I wonder if there can be some reform in child support, whether they were married or not married, and in enforcement.
So that's a great point. And one of the things that we've been looking at through the work of the Women's Commission is one of our committees is the Workforce Development Committee. And the issue that kept coming up as we had community conversations was, in order to advance in the workplace, I have to have access to safe, affordable childcare. And that has been a challenge. And so we are looking actually at partnering with the county to run a child care pilot. And you may be familiar with it, there's a term of art called the benefits cliff, which is the average wage at which a woman, steps up in a raise, from $10 an hour to $12 an hour, or $10 an hour to $11, and loses all of her benefits. So all of a sudden she can no longer afford child care. So we are looking at instead partnering with the county to kind of build a bridge out of poverty and step down child care and other public assistance benefits as the woman moves up in the workforce, recognizing that a woman is only going to be able to advance as far as she can when she has safe and accessible child care for her children.
State your name and ask your question.
Hi, I'm going to apologize because I have two questions. But my first is, my name's Nichole Burris. I am a candidate for Upper Arlington City Council, and I was very fortunate to be invited today by a current City Councilwoman, Carolyn Casper, who also invited another female candidate, Michelle Hoyle, so that we could all be a part of this and have a chance to listen and hear from you. Haven't heard a lot today about women and their engagement in the political process and what we can do to support female candidates. As you all know, more women at the table really broadens the conversation. My second question is, I also work for a national nonprofit small business organization called Small Business Majority, and we've conducted scientific opinion polling on small businesses and their opinions on the minimum wage. Can you elaborate a little bit, because most small business owners support a raise of the federal minimum wage, why a minimum wage is stagnant, both locally, statewide, federally, and the impact that would have, raising the minimum wage, on women here in Central Ohio?
Great question. I'll start with the first one. I completely agree with you that engagement by women in the political process is very important. I talk about this a lot, and I always like to say a couple clarifying details. So, there is a trope that goes around that a woman needs to be asked 7 times, or sometimes it's 27 times, in order to actually decide to make a run for office. And, frankly, I don't think that's always true. And I think that that's a little bit of like blame gaming women. I think women are really astute, and they see the way that networks of power are set up. And maybe some of that reticence reflects their perception of, of winnability, right? So I think it's important to say as many times as we can that women win offices they run for as often as men do. So once they actually get into the process, women appeal to voters the same way that men do. I know that we don't have a great example of that last November, but in general, the statistics show that voters are absolutely willing to elect women. But oftentimes, the very same problem that Mike talked about with a group of men who kind of say, well, we know this guy, he can try to go on the business trip and help prove himself. The way that networks are set up, a lot of times men are asked more, right? It's not that women need to be asked 7 times and men only need to be asked once, but men are just kind of asked more. They're recruited more. And so we all need to be doing things to change that. And that is not just incumbent upon those of us who work in political arenas, but that's really incumbent upon everybody who works in the civic space, which I would say everyone in this room does, and most people in our city do. So people like Nicole Dunn, who helped bring the Galvanize program here to Ohio, where 500 women showed up for a full weekend of training around all kinds of ways to get engaged, but particularly a women's track for running for office. So it's important to push these tools and make sure that women see those within their grasp. I also ran for office when I was 7 months pregnant, so I understand I understand how life limits you sometimes, but it's when people have faith that you can step up and do it, you can. I don't know if anyone has anything else on that. On your point on minimum wage, that's a very complex question and a good one. And I can't speak to why the minimum wage is stagnant. It is a pervasive problem and has been for decades. And even when the federal minimum wage increases, we see that the tipped minimum wage is 2 something. That doesn't increase. So there are a lot of forces at play in the federal minimum wage. Here in Columbus, there is a state constitutional issue that governs how our state minimum wage was increased several years ago, that limits localities from being able to raise their own minimum wages, and it's a problem. It's a problem, and I do think as policymakers we've got to look at all the solutions that are on the table too. So what Shannon was saying about the creative pilot program that we're considering for childcare. I mean, that's one way that we can help make sure a better lifestyle is attainable for even those who make lower wages.
Please state your name and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Julene Allen. I'm chair of Lean in Ohio and also founder of the global program Lean in Women of Color. If any of you are familiar with Lean In, it is highly big on equal pay, what we're talking about right now. One of the things that we did at Lean In Women of Color is we launched a conversation, we launched a discussion at Procter & Gamble a couple months ago. And it was all about bringing different women together from different backgrounds. And we brought together senior leaders so that they can take this information back to their teams regarding intersectional experiences that different women were facing. And I thank Elizabeth for noting that women of color are affected the most. So what is the Women's Commission centered? What are we doing to address racial bias and diversity in pay and what women of color are experiencing in the workplace?
I think from the Women's Commission point of view and from the community point of view, it is about starting the conversation with, again, just showing the data so that people are aware. And then as we implement initiatives on the equal pay piece, I think the education is going to be key to that. Mike, I don't know, does Cardinal have any specific strategies?
We do. I think, first of all, I think Lean In, if you haven't read it, you need to read the book. You should read that book, and there's several I could tell you if you're interested in gender equity. But we actually have employee resource groups for various, so we have an African American resource group, a Latino, Hispanic affinity group, and women affinity. So we try to address the various needs of, various constituents within Cardinal because they are very different. So yes, we do have it. It's a hard issue to get after, for sure. It's probably easier for us in business because in the sense of if a person's doing the same job, you can still, work through those types of things versus in the community, there's a host of other, challenges that you have, but we absolutely do.
Okay. And as you know, the affinity groups, employee groups these are just women who have commonality that are coming together. And so it's important for, like you stated, senior leaders, men, to come to the table. So in this pledge that we're building at the Women's Commission, are we addressing, not just women in general that are getting paid unequal? Are we addressing in the pledge or educating our employers about how this is impacting women of color?
Is your question, do we speak specifically to the issue of diversity and inclusion in the pledge? Is that?
Well, yeah, is the pledge, or I'm assuming it's probably accompanied by education resources. So are we addressing racial issues, implicit biases? Mm-hmm.
So thanks for your clarification. So the first step is going to be the launch of the voluntary pay equity pledge, and then accompanying that will be a series of learning collaboratives. And I would absolutely anticipate that in those learning collaboratives where we partner with our employers who have signed on, that we would address some of the, let me call them, underlying issues that contribute to the issue of equal pay and pay equity.
You made a comment I think is really important for folks in here, that as you have these affinity groups, if you don't have a senior leader who has the stature within the organization and, very importantly, a budget that they can actually work with. So I started running our women's initiative about 7 years ago or so. At that time, I was CEO of our pharmaceutical segment, so I had plenty of dollars. And so when we decided to do training, this, what we call our Women's Leading Change and our Partners Leading Change classes, it's like $8,000 a head. So if all of a sudden, if I had not had a budget, because I knew it would happen, I would have people, I'd say, okay, I want these 25 women to go and these 25 men to go. then people are like, well, but I don't have that in my budget, so I can't afford to send them, and then the thing just dies on its own weight. So if you don't recognize those types of things, versus I just said, I'll pay for everybody in the company. I'll absorb it in my segment, even though medical people are going, corporate people are going, that aren't my responsibility. I have a responsibility to the organization for this. So I was able to do that, versus if someone had been sponsoring, our women's initiative that didn't have it, then these types of things get very, very hard. So as you think about doing these things, if you don't have executive leaders who have the ability to fund things and get things done, you can't move it forward, to your point. They've got to be engaged and committed.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more quick question, and we got to rush through it because they're rushing me, so get it in. That'd be great.
No problem. I can be fast. My name is Abby David, and I am the co-founder and executive director of Bridgeway Academy, and we serve children and individuals with autism and other developmental disabilities. And we have 18 and 19-year-olds coming up who are young women. And so our research has shown us that there are not, first of all, a lot of jobs out there for very employable individuals with disabilities, and let alone when they do have jobs, then the equality in pay is even less than African American women, Latino women, and women in general. So my question to you is, what work is being done on behalf of those with developmental disabilities and equality in pay and in the workplace for women?
You want to start? Go ahead. In terms of the work of the Women's Commission, as I mentioned, we're starting obviously with the discussion around equal pay, building up to pay equity, which includes a whole bunch of pieces, and focusing on all types of women, right? Women with disabilities, African American women, Latino women, white women. So I think our work will build. We launched the commission about 8 months ago now. And so I think as we continue to evolve in our infrastructure and our abilities to understand data specific to this community, those are issues that we'll be looking to fold in to community health strategy, to pay equity strategy, to start to address all women in our community, because that ultimately is our goal, is the economic empowerment of all women in this community. So it's absolutely on our radar screen.
And the only thing I'd add is that Shannon's commitment to data is very deep. That's one thing I've learned as a women's commissioner, and it's excellent and educational. But so that this pay equity pledge is also it's asking the CEOs of these companies to be as committed to data, right, as we are, and so as committed to understanding the data in their companies about all of these gaps of all women, no matter your race or color or background. And so I just want to vouch for how incredibly comprehensive this dedication to data has been from the Commission.
Okay, send over to Mo.
We're going to leave it there today, but let's thank this wonderful panel and this great conversation for today. Thanks again to all of our sponsors, including King Business Interiors, Gebman Communications, Barnes & Thornburg, Columbus Business First, WBNS 10 TV, and the Women's Fund of Central Ohio. Thanks again to our founder, Mary Lazarus, for her support, and to this great panel, Shannon Ginther, Michael Kaufmann, Elizabeth Brown, and Yolanda Harris. We'll see you soon.